Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Darwinian Delusions, and with me is Pondering Soul, Yusuf. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. How are you doing?
How are you? You look like you've been enjoying yourself after Ramadan. You've got this new radiance.
I've failed. 1 second. Sorry, I had two windows open then. And,
you're hearing an echo.
I did. You wouldn't have heard it though because I had the headphones on.
Yeah,
Sorry, what did you say then?
I'm just saying you're looking fresh. You're looking well. You're looking good.
I'm feeling tired. I've been sleeping. We had I told you, didn't I? We had the funeral in Glasgow.
Yes.
And we came back with my sister, and so I've ended up having to sleep on the floor basically. Well, there's been a few bits going on, but yeah, alhamdulillah. Other than that, not doing too bad.
Excellent, good. So just to let everybody know, Yusuf, his dissertation in his degree, which mashallah you can see the dissertation online. That was on nihilism. He got a distinction for that. He got a distinction for the degree overall. And this particular topic of nihilism, I've been speaking to you guys about this a lot, even in the live stream videos in which Yusuf's not here. And we're going to finalize it today. We're going to do the final part of the discussion, inshallah. And then we're going to move on to that video, which everybody has been talking about, which is optimistic nihilism. We're going to do a review of that. So Yusuf, crack away, inshallah. Bismillah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So yeah, just to kind of massively summarize everything we've been talking about. So chapter 1 went into what nihilism is and what the meaning of meaning is. We went through Nietzsche's idea of what that was. Chapter 2, we looked at the necessity of leaps of faith. We did that by comparing two philosophers' thoughts. First one was Kierkegaard, and the second one was Camus. And basically, I showed that regardless of who you are, what you believe, that there's a necessity of having to make leaps of faith, which follows from our being finite beings, from being limited. I've posted the link for the article in the chat there, so if you want to read through it at any point. But yeah, and so after concluding about the necessity of the leap of faith, we then moved on to chapter 3 of the essay, which starts to focus in on this idea of the will to meaning, or how should we respond to the problem of nihilism. And I rely heavily upon Viktor Frankl, who was a survivor from the concentration camps in Nazi Germany, who was a psychologist and ended up writing one of the best-selling books called Man's Search for Meaning, which is a book I highly recommend anybody reading. Generally, it's not complex. He gives a good overview of his experience in the concentration camps, and then he goes on to explain what he outlines is basically a response to the experience of meaninglessness. And he calls it tragic optimism. And we basically in part 3, and over the last couple of episodes we've done, Sabor, we went over the will to meaning, what it is, its derivatives, how a good will to meaning doesn't see power or pleasure as ends or as things which are the goals. Power is a means to achieving a meaningful life. Yep. And pleasure is the consequence of having achieved it. Neither of them being the thing that you need to achieve in and of itself, but one of them being the thing that leads up to being able to achieve it, and the other being something that is the consequence of having achieved it. Yep. So we kind of went over that, and then we had to kind of speak about our destiny being to suffer, which leads on to his tragic optimism, the fact that suffering is an inevitable part of life. Philosophies that tell you, that the aim should be happiness, this American philosophy of the pursuit of happiness. These are incredibly naive because they completely disregard the fact that as you get older, suffering intensifies. You become, more ill. You become weak. You come closer to death. You lose the people you love. More people die as time goes on. You have more reason to suffer than you do when you're young. And this is inevitable. And so any philosophy that neglects the fact that life can become harder as you get older it's missing a major part of what it means to be human. And so you should, first of all, acknowledge that life is suffering, and you should submit to that, but you shouldn't let it be something that crushes you. It's just, in order for you to live an authentic life, it's something you need to really acknowledge as an inevitable part of life, something you're going to have to deal with. And insofar as you neglect the truth of that, you are putting your head in the sand. You're avoiding understanding what it means for you to be human. And in order to kind of live an authentic life, you need to live towards death. You need to acknowledge that you're moving towards an end. And only at that point, only upon recognizing that, can you live authentically. And then kind of moving on from there, we move on to the third section of this chapter, which discusses the whole free will versus determinism. And in short, I argue that there is no solid argument in favor of either one. That there seems to be good reason to believe in both. And yet there's this tension that arises out of it. But philosophically speaking, there isn't like a definitive argument that kind of ends one or gives victory to the other. And so because in terms of philosophy, we can't determine the truth of one over the other, in this sort of kind of dichotomy, where you're looking at one having to necessarily win out over the other, and that when people look at these things as though they can't exist with one another, that we don't have a reason to believe in one way or the other. So I take a pragmatic approach, and I outline the problems with having to look at the world through a deterministic lens, and the issues that follow from that, and basically show that like it undermines itself. Like in order to have any sort of successful outcome in any sense, you can't dismiss free will, because if you do, you lose your sense of justice. You can't punish people if then they're not in control of what they're doing. Or if you can, ironically, it starts to tread into weird territory, basically. But yeah, so everything relies on this sense of responsibility from our morality, law, politics, public policy, intimate relationships with one another, feelings of guilt, etc. Personal accomplishment. Like how can you really praise anyone for something if they didn't play a role in that, if it wasn't if they didn't choose to give charity, if it was kind of forced upon them. And now, after kind of concluding that and saying that although you can't dismiss one or the other, you necessarily have to live with both. You have to live with the idea that we are responsible beings, that we are agents that can make choices, and that we have to live with those choices and we have to make them. And any sort of dismissal of that is just a sort of escapism from the responsibility of being human. And so moving on from there, we're talking about responsibility. Section 4 is titled that. It's titled Taking Responsibility. And this is the finale of this particular chapter and of the essay in total. And so I'll just outline what I talk about in here. So first of all, I point out that Viktor Frankl, he suffered a lot in the concentration camps. And if you read the book, you will see how much so. He describes some horrible things. Walaikum salam, Jordan. He describes some horrible things, some horrible experiences. And it's amazing to think that anyone could overcome that at all. And in the book, he points out that many people didn't, even when they got their freedom. That freedom itself ended up leading to their downfall. They became crazy with freedom, and many of them, there were stories of like people when they were released from the concentration camps, they became just as evil as the thing that they escaped in some cases, which is interesting. But he points out that basically suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds meaning, and that this should motivate the seeking of meaning itself. What he means by this is, like, he points out, there's a really good quote here I'll read. that I take from his books. He says, we who live in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And this I found really profound and really moving because, in every way in the concentration camps, people were just reduced to nothing. Like whatever you could use to kind of distinguish one person from another. In the concentration camp, all of that was taken away from them. Like that one would go in as a psychologist, another as a laborer, someone else as a scientist or a teacher. All of that was, meant nothing in the concentration camps. All of that was pointless. Like they were reduced to the numbers that they were tattooed with, and they were all treated, as subhuman, as in horrible ways. And all that was left at that point, they were all sharing these terrible circumstances, and all that was left in terms of what you could distinguish between the different characters was how they responded to those circumstances. Some of them gave up completely. Some of them refused to work. They would lie down, refuse to eat, and they just gave up on life. And there was no amount of beating, no amount of coercion that would make them get up. They just, there was no moving them, and they'd just lie down and die. SubhanAllah, it's scary to think. And if you're listening to this, I really want you to imagine being in such a situation where that seems to you a completely valid option, just to give up, just to lie down. And somehow that starving to death on the floor in the cold, or where, Poland can be quite a brutal place in the winter, especially. Like, and they were in there for years. It wasn't like a summer camp. It was a long time, and so they had to endure all of this. And out of that, just the simple thought that isn't what everyone did. That everyone didn't just give up. That there were people that still had this, as he describes there, that's a will to comfort others, to give away the last pieces of bread. They ate, they had soup that was very watered down, and if they were lucky, if the person that was serving the soup liked them, they'd put the ladle to the bottom of the tub and get out some of the veg and give it to them. If you weren't that lucky, then you'd just be getting mostly water that had been boiled with vegetables in it, and you'd maybe getting some nutrition from that, and a small piece of bread, and maybe some, like a tiny bit of butter if you were lucky. And that was their meal every day. And they were worked long and hard. And despite all of this, there were still people that had hope, that still found meaning in life, even in such circumstances. And
just wanted to add a small thing there. For anybody watching right now, and I'll say this in the end, if you look at the interview that I did with Sister Zumrat and Sister Gul Bahar, both of them survivors of the concentration camps in Chinese-occupied East Turkestan, this is probably the most powerful message that will resonate with you, because you'll see that in real life, where faith or giving meaning to your suffering helped them survive those camps.
Yeah, and I guess for those of you who maybe struggle reading things or struggle being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, if you're just taking it from like words on a page, the videos where you're having a discussion, with the sister in particular, there was a clip of it going around on Twitter, and that clip was only like 3 minutes, where she's talking about them urinating on her and asking her if she does wudu. And so, like, subhanallah, the fact that like people can go through things like this and still see meaning in it. So like he says there, like, so suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds a meaning. Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to understanding how to react to this sort of thing, like life for the most part, for people in the West, you know, we're suffering from things like depression, from nihilism, from a lack of motivation, a lack of will. We find it hard to find meaning in life because things can get a bit repetitive and boring, and there's nothing significant happening.
Yeah.
There's nothing that happens in one person's life to make them stand out necessarily much from the next.
Yeah.
And you know, this can be a drain on people, like, because what are we talking when we're talking about, well, is my life meaningful? You know, is your life meaningful? We're talking about, like, is it significant? You know, in what way is it significant? And you know, if there's not really much going on in your life, it's hard to figure out how it can be significant. And this issue arises out of constantly comparing yourself maybe to like the celebrity class in society, and like, you know, look at what they're doing. They got to go to the Maldives every weekend, and they've got so much going on in their lives. And like me here in this little town in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, exactly. And like, how is it then that you make yourself feel significant? And the thing here is that the potential for meaning is always present. And when I say the potential for meaning, I don't mean the potential to create it, but the potential to discover it, to find significance is always there, unless it's suppressed by a baseless hopelessness, or leaps of faith into the denial of free will, i.e., oh, you know, this is my life, I can't do anything about it, blah blah blah, like, what can I do? That's nothing more than a giving up. It's nothing more than a submission to the assumed meaninglessness of life. And insofar as you submit to life being meaningless, you've given up any hope of discovering it anymore. And you've closed the door, and you've just said, I'm not going to look for it anymore. But just because you've given up looking for it, it doesn't mean that it's not there to find. And this is the major issue here in terms of like facing nihilism. It's not a fact of the world. It's not, you know, objectively the case that your life is meaningless. That, you know, that hasn't been established at all. It's basically a psychological phenomenon. You experience life as meaningless, but that doesn't say that it is. There's not a proof, you know, philosophically or, you know, in any other sense, that your life is meaningless and pointless and insignificant. You know, it hasn't established it. And Viktor Frankl, the way he words it, he says that it's man's, or, you know, mankind's duty to bear his incapacity to grasp life's unconditional meaningfulness in rational terms. So basically, the way he describes it is that maybe logos is deeper than logic. Maybe life is, you know, we can kind of dip into the, you know, the hard problem of consciousness here. We haven't sussed. Go on.
What do you mean? What does he mean by logos?
Logos, he's talking about the underlying meaning, basically. So I'm guessing it's maybe
from a biblical perspective. He's speaking about it.
So logos here, I've just pulled up a dictionary definition: the word of God or principle of divine reason and creative order, or in the Jungian psychology, the principle of reason and judgment associated with the animus, often contrasted with eros. In the context, I understand it, he's talking about you know, understanding the meaning of life. So when he's talking about logos being deeper than reason, he's talking in the context of feeling significance in your life, or having you know, in relation to the will to meaning. And so what he's saying here is that sometimes, like, one of the issues is when you try to rationalize things too much, you can rob it of its significance. So sometimes the significance of something is surrounded by its mystery. Sometimes, you know, it's surrounded by the parts of it you don't know as much as the parts that you do.
Yeah.
Like, for example, when someone steps forward to save someone else. Like for example, going back to the example of the people in the concentration camps who, despite their circumstances and the conditions they were in, would give up their last piece of bread. How do you like rationalize that? But you hear it.
You know, one other thing, just to add to that, is human nature. A Hobbesian view would predict we would slip back to that stage and become like rats and become like snitches and you know, work against each other. Yet we find people sometimes have the most amount of compassion.
Yeah, and it's important to note that there are people that do turn like that do turn on each other, become snitches. There was like in the concentration camp, there was some Jews that became I can't remember the word for it, but they became the guards, or they were given the position of guard, and they were treated better than everyone else in the camp, and they would deal with everyone else in the camp, and they were said to be even worse than the Nazis in terms of how they dealt with everyone that was in the camp, and they were prisoners as well. They weren't there by choice. They were just put there because they were also Jews, but they made certain choices, and I thought maybe someone can put the name of those people. They had a particular title in the camps, but they corroborators. I can't remember. I think there was a German name for it that I'm thinking of, but yeah. So there were people that did act as like, it was expected you would do in a very animalistic way. They would fight each other for certain things. But then you would think that would be what everyone would do if it was, if we were simply just animals. Like that, you get this. Like there was experiments done where they put a monkey in a cage with its baby, and they made the floor hot, and they made it hotter and hotter and hotter, and for a certain amount of time, the mother would protect the baby. But then when it got to a certain point where it became too hot to bear, the mother would put the baby on the floor and stand on it to protect itself from the heat. SubhanAllah. And there are humans that do that, but there are humans that don't. There are humans that, and I guess there's even animals that do this. And it's like, there's a lot more to it than.
Well, the first thing it does is it sort of sheds the atomic, predictable nature of human behavior, and it opens up a quantum domain of complexity. It shows where actually this very simple Hobbesian nature, this very simple nature that society is essentially based upon. It's definitely not that. Even if you're the most hardcore militant atheist, from an Islamic perspective, we can bring in the fitrah, we can give an explanation, but on the minimum, from your perspective, you would have to acknowledge there's some serious problems with your explanation here. This is definitely not something that fits into a certain pigeonhole.
Yeah, and there's something about it as well. Like, it's accompanied by a severe sense of beauty. Like, just even reading about it, just hearing about it, and you don't need to know much. All you need to know is that that one little simple bit that, despite being in some of the worst conditions that anybody could ever live in, people were still willing to try to make other people smile or laugh or to give away their last piece of bread. Like, subhanallah. And so there's something significant about these particular circumstances, and like he himself, he saw this as a perfect example of that the human being has a will, and that the human being has a degree of control over what they do with this will. Obviously, Islamically speaking, everything is dependent on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if, for example, we have to constantly remember here that we're talking on different layers. So if I make you a cake, Sabur, and I say, I've made you a cake, we could say, oh wait, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the provider of all things. He facilitated everything. That's all true. But it doesn't negate that I can still say I made a cake, even though, like, theologically speaking and fundamentally speaking, all of that process relies upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order to be able to do it in the first place. But that doesn't mean I can't say the words that I made you a cake, so here you go. Or, if someone's asking you, who made you that? You could say, oh, Yusuf made it. There's nothing wrong with it. And in the same sense, in terms of freedoms, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala facilitates our ability to make choices, and he brings about the states of reality that allow those things to manifest. But we still can say, despite that we have a level of agency, that we have the ability to make choices, and that we have responsibility to make those choices, and that making them in the wrong sense is if you make bad choices, you're worthy of condemnation for that. Like the examples that you gave with the Uyghur brothers and sisters and the treatment that they're undergoing, or even better now, the treatment of the gentleman that's currently gone viral, the police officer in America who plays that gentleman, and him placing his knee upon his neck. These actions are worthy of condemnation. And with regards to good deeds, like the people that gave away the last piece of bread, these are worthy of praise, and they're only worthy of praise and condemnation if the people that make these decisions are responsible for them decisions. It doesn't make any sense to praise or condemn them if they're if they play no part in the manifestation of these things.
What happens to human history? Because human history has been described by some historians as a history of hero worship. That you have these people that take responsibility, they decide to change the world, there's a problem, reaction, solution, they do something significant. If we can't take responsibility, then essentially all these things are meaningless.
Yeah.
They were just prone to do it because of their genetic makeup.
But it becomes a necessary consequence of this materialistic determinism. Like it necessitates that you flush all the meaning out. But the thing is that this materialistic determinism isn't this way of thinking hasn't been proven sufficiently. And one of the major issues is that it has the assumption that everything can be boiled down to its physical substrate, to atoms and electrons and neurons and so on and so forth. But that is an assumption that hasn't been shown sufficiently. And one of the major issues is, again, linking to our finitude. We're limited beings. If there is something that we don't know, one of the biggest issues is we can't know that we don't know it. Otherwise, we wouldn't say that we don't know. And there's a lot that we don't know. And there's probably there's usually a nice little graph that pops around. It's like things you know you don't know, and these like make up a tiny part of the pie chart. And then the things you don't know. Like Allahu Alam, like how much do we comprehend?
Or the famous saying, the universe is not just queerer than we can suppose, but queerer than we can. No, not queer. Basically, the universe is queerer than we can even suppose, right?
Yeah.
I don't remember the exact quote, but you get my point. You don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And one thing I think that definitely comes across, and by the way, for everybody, I've just brought up Yusuf's dissertation here, which you can see, and we are obviously on the part about taking responsibility, which you can get this dissertation at ponderingsoul.blogs, and then when you go in there, you'll find it. So we're just on this last part as a reminder for anybody that wants to follow it. So Yusuf, about this particular point that you raised, it kind of fits in here, because if you don't know what you don't know, and you need to be more humble about the fact that you have to appeal to faith, it sort of fits in with this idea which you highlighted.
Do you want me to read it?
Yeah, which Frederick Schelling also sort of highlights.
Yeah, so just reading there. So there is clearly a tension that is always going to be present between such dichotomies as is present in faith and reason, free will and determinism, and the experience of meaning and nihilism, to name a few. However, this tension should not be avoided by renouncing one side in favor of the other. Friedrich Schelling criticizes this very decision in his philosophical investigations of the essence of human freedom, where he states, to pull oneself out of the conflict by renouncing reason seems closer to flight than to victory. With the same justification, another could turn his back on freedom in order to throw himself into the arms of reason and necessity, without there being cause to triumph on either the one or the other side. So this is the thing. It's like people, I can't help but think that maybe the reason people give up on, because here he's making a dichotomy, and he does in in his essay, he points out that there seems to be a conflict with this idea of seeing the world as intelligible, as seeing the world as something that you can explore and discover all truths in the world through reason and investigation, and that this idea is what's leading people to want to give up on the idea of freedom, because freedom complicates that picture. If you have this concept of freedom, then the world ceases to be something that you can map. It becomes chaotic by the presence of freedom. And for those who really are not comfortable with the idea of chaos, that they would much rather give up on the idea of freedom than submit to the idea that the world isn't necessarily fully explorable through the use of reason, basically. And we've mentioned this issue prior at the beginning of this essay and our discussions about it, where the idea of reason itself is an issue. How do you justify reason? What means do you have to explain that reason itself is something that you can rely upon without falling into circular reasoning? Like if all you have to prove things are rational arguments, you have an issue here, because then what you're going to end up having to say is that either you give a rational argument in favor of reason, which obviously presupposes reason in order to then justify it, which is circular reasoning, or you rely on faith. You rely on a leap of faith that your rational capacities are trustworthy. You don't go into questioning it. You just begin with the axiom or the assumption, that reason works, and that we have the ability to find truth via reason. And that's obviously an issue here, because those who kind of ridicule those who have faith in things, and you get it in the name of even some of the YouTubers, like rationality rules, and pretty much many of the new atheist scene, they talk as faith is a dirty word, reason and rationality is some sort of superpower they all have, and they don't make any or very little faith-based judgments. And it's like, well, no, the very thing that you're putting right at the top of your value hierarchy requires a massive leap of faith in order to do so, because we know that that's not the only way to live. We know that. Go on.
Even a very basic thing. I mean, you definitely highlighted our rational capabilities being trustworthy, but apart from that, it's the fact that truth itself is valuable, and better to believe something that's true rather than believing what's false. Because you just simply say, well, it doesn't matter if reason leads to truth. Why is truth of any value? Why should I just live my life with false beliefs which make me happy? And additional to that, so that you have to have faith in these sort of value judgments which you can never empirically prove. Apart from that, there's the idea of the uniformity of nature, that underlying all of nature and all of the scientific super imposing that we actually do on nature. Fundamentally, there are some immutable universal laws, and these the uniformity of nature is something you can never prove. You just have to assume it. So there's three distinct problems here. There's the problem of obviously rationality being justified, which is you can't unless you do it in a circular way. You have to do it based upon faith. Truth itself having that moral sort of judgment that it's valuable. Again, on faith, and underlying all of reality, you ultimately, as an atheist, have uniformity of nature, which you have to just assume.
Yeah.
Faith, what I really love about your dissertation, I think it makes it impossible for any person, no matter how sophisticated their semantical evasions are, to get away with the idea that you can't have faith. Faith just seems inevitable, no matter, even if you're a militant atheist, if you go through the line of reasoning that you've highlighted in the dissertation.
It's not just inevitable in like arbitrary, side issues either. It's inevitable with the underlying principles that their entire systems of thought depend upon. That, like, faith is such an integral part of the human being that, like, you can, to be authentic, you can only be honest about what you have faith in.
Yes.
And at that point, those who belittle faith and deny it and talk about it like it's some sort of dirty word, that is a massive red flag. Now, if they could admit this, and if they would to cease using it as a dirty word, then it's, it would still at least be like a respectable position. I'd give them their dues for at least admitting what they have faith in. And, and if they were to stop kind of ridiculing and belittling everyone else, from whatever religious community, that there is something specific about the human condition which has given rise to huge faith systems all over the planet, regardless of how much they're varying. And that's not an insignificant thing. Like, that's not, there is a lot you can learn about the human being by understanding the fact that these faith systems seem to develop universally across all, societies. And if there was a society that didn't have some sort of faith system, it didn't survive. It's not here. We've got no, there's nothing remaining of that. And all we have is what's available now, what's developed in the modern day as a result of this kind of, the onset of nihilism.
Yeah.
And this is interesting. And then you have these common themes that run through all of these faith systems. So the videos that have been done with Brother Jerry on the iEra channel about the history of monotheism, that's a great resource to kind of link onto this idea, that it's not necessarily just this chaotic thing. There is an element of chaos to it, because you've got obviously the polytheism, the monotheism, the paganism, the this, the that. But there are themes that run underneath that seem to unite things in certain places. And this isn't a perennialism. We're talking here about the origins of the one religion, and how these, and there are arguments. I've got specific things. It's a bit superfluous for this. Maybe inshallah I'll do another video on it. But that link to this idea of the one original religion that was distorted by the inevitable consequence of human creativity and isolation of groups. So you have a particular group of people that eventually differ for whatever reason, and they split. One goes one way, the other goes the other. Long periods of time, isolation develops a language into distinct. So these two groups that were one become two separate groups, and their creative approach to their traditions end up expressing themselves in completely different ways. So many generations down the line, they come to meet each other again. They have different ways of expressing the same thing, and they can become confused into thinking they're talking about different things. So, one has one word for God, another has another word for God. For whatever reason, each group ended up expressing it artistically. They started drawing pictures and making stories and so on and so forth to express the idea of the thing that made them, that brought them into being. And then all of a sudden, you've got two distinct religions. But it's only because they've not managed to be able to watch how their language has developed over time, how it's changed, and how they can't see that happening. And you see evidences of why that might occur today with the youth, with slang, for example. Like when I was younger, we had our own little personal language with our friends, and now I'm looking at the current younger generation, and their distinct new language, and they're talking, and I can barely understand what they're saying. And you can see how when they get older, and we die off, and they become the elder generation, how that might become what would be considered the new language, and then their youth are going to go through the same process of doing the same thing, of playing with language, being creative with it, making it develop. And you can see why languages develop over time, why they change, and you can then understand why there might be differences in the way things are expressed over a large period of time. That's a bit of a tangent to what my dissertation is going on, because I don't make reference to this in there. And bringing it back to the dissertation so we can kind of conclude it a bit. So after that, I mentioned that these tensions, rather than being seen as something that you need to like panic about and pick one or the other, as Schelling describes it, as a sort of fleeing. Instead, the tensions can be seen as part of a healthy source of motivation. Something that challenges those who take responsibility and affirm the tension and acknowledge them both, and affirm not only the tension between these ideas, but also affirm to be able to grapple with this in any conclusive way. Like we have our limits. We have these ideas. They're with us, for whatever reason, we have them. They're here. And we can't escape that. And all we can do is deal with them and with the consequences of the necessity of them. So we have to deal with the idea of being responsible agents, because it's integral to our concepts of justice, and everything else that I listed out before, to our concepts of morality. All of these things like depend on the agency of the human being, on the ability for a human being to make decisions. And there's nothing wrong with just like acknowledging that and accepting it. It's here, it's there. There's no way, like people have been going into this determinism argument for centuries. And they've not stepped any closer to being able to prove that we don't have agency, that we don't have the ability to make choices. There's many people who are very confident that they have, but like looking at the arguments they've provided is, as far as I'm concerned, that they're far from it. They're far from concluding that. So the tension is here. You should acknowledge it. You are finite. You should acknowledge that. You have to make leaps of faith. Acknowledge that. If you deny free will, you have to make a leap of faith in that denial. If you deny, any sort of, and any of these concepts that we've been talking about, and if you affirm them, there are leaps of faith integral to all of these. So now the question is basically like own up to it, deal with it, allow this tension to motivate you to do things, to motivate, like, so long as it's possible that the idea of free will is true, then you now have yourself this moment, this eureka moment. Like if you've been following this dissertation, if you've been following what I've been saying, this is the moment now for you, the person watching this video, for you listening, for you, the one reading the dissertation, to reflect on what this means for you as a person. When you're sat there, and if you're like many people in the modern day, depressed, wondering about what it is that you're going to do with life, you're overwhelmed by the sheer amount of choices that you have available to you. Like you've got the choice. Either you carry on avoiding making these decisions, avoiding taking the responsibility. Allahu Alam, maybe it's out of fear of making the wrong decision. Maybe it's out of fear of like not achieving the things you want to achieve. But like, if you just give up on that idea now, you might that's not getting you any closer. And if anything, you're removing the possibility of that altogether. And surely acknowledging the fact that you have the ability to make choices, that you have the ability to at least work towards them. And obviously you need to make realistic goals. You need to be able to understand that there's only so much that you can do. And like, if your aim is to kind of be the king of the world, maybe you're setting your goalposts too high. But the argument here is simply, don't dismiss free will. Don't simply fall into determinism when it's far from conclusive. Someone's mentioned here as well ambiguity fallacy. This is the issue, though, isn't it? The idea that the human being, like everything is ambiguous to a certain degree. There's only so much we can know for certain, and we have to deal with that. We have to deal with our finitude. And people seem too eager to fall into this nihilistic pit of hopelessness. And the question is why? Why should you do that? Why? Go on, sorry.
You've got nothing to lose. Even if you look at the two options with reason, atheism with nihilism and theism with escape route, you've got nothing to lose with trying out theism.
Yeah. So
atheism, you're just going to lose out anyway.
Mr. Atheist here has said faith, belief without reason. Right. So how do we justify reason? Again, like leading it back to what we've been talking about here.
Yeah, just
how
this the atheist said faith is belief without reason. The Muslim has said faith is belief with reason. And the thing which Yusuf's been saying, correct me if I'm wrong, Yusuf, is both of those are wrong. Essentially, we're saying both have to have a level of faith, and we're just sort of just acknowledging that, and then we are making decisions about what makes more sense.
Yeah, you're dealing, and this isn't going to make everyone a theist. The aim of this dissertation wasn't to convince people of theism, of God, or of anything. The aim of this dissertation was to explain a common phenomenon within the modern world, which is nihilism. And the nihilism is the necessary consequence of a lot of the issues that we face today. And when people are suffering from nihilism, that it causes them severe pain. And this is very subtle, and it's present, it's here, and it's affecting at least someone that everyone knows. Like I don't know anyone who hasn't come across someone who's not suffered from depression or some sort of existential crisis. And it's likely that every person in the chat and every person watching this video at some point in their life is going to have to deal with this themselves. This feeling of nihilism, this feeling of meaninglessness. And this is basically an attempt to try to pull people out of that rut. Whether it makes them move towards theism or not, whether they stay in their atheism, is beyond the point. Do what you do. If you want to be an atheist, go ahead. At least acknowledge you're making leaps of faith in this decision. That's all I'm asking. To acknowledge the necessity of faith. That faith isn't just necessarily this idea of belief without reason or with reason. That it's it's an a priori part of our structure that like you come across, because sometimes it's like when the clock is ticking and you have a decision to make, and you've not got the liberty of having to, time to sit and think about the decision and what's going on and how you're going to respond to the situation. You've just got to respond, and if you don't respond, that's still a response. Say again. Yeah, it's inescapable, and you've just got to make that leap in a decision. You've got to make, and look, whether reason or no reason, there's probably little parts of both playing in there. There's probably elements of reason in certain aspects that have led you to making whatever choice you've made, and there's probably elements of no reason. But there's, it's hard to pin down exactly what is giving rise to it. But faith is the only way to describe it. You make a choice, and you don't have access to hindsight. You don't know what are the inevitable conclusions to all of that. And so inshallah, Mr. Atheist will read that. But what I take sometimes as well, when I've had certain atheists listen to me talk about this, that they've confused this as a necessary argument in favor of theism or in favor of God, or it's really not what's going on in the dissertation at all. It's just trying to get them to acknowledge what it means to be human, and the necessary consequences of modern society, issues that we're all going to have to face, including the Muslim world, including the theist. Because nihilism isn't taking any prisoners. Like it's it's dealing with everyone, and you like being a theist isn't necessarily going to get you away from this. And the issues are to do with the values of the people and what they're recognizing in themselves. Because if you look at even Islamic history, there was this issue with fatalism within the Islamic tradition. People, and I've made mention of the discussion that Mohammed Hijab had with an ex-Muslim in Canada, where they were talking about this tension between free will and determinism. Being like a sort of motivation for leaving Islam, and then Mohammed Hijab points out, well, you're not escaping that problem.
Yeah, it's worse.
Like, yeah, it's not gone anywhere. Like you can leave a religion, you can join a religion all you want. Like these answers are still elusive. They're still strange. They're still very complex. But yeah, so probably good to just so here I'll just read the end bit. So furthermore, there is a tension between the philosophical concepts. There is a tension in life itself. This is between what one was in the past, what one is now, and what one can be in the future. So this idea of like, because we are what we were, we are what we are now, and we are what we want to be. Like all of these things are at play, and sometimes they can all be very different. Like thinking now of what I was back in the day, where I am now, and what I aspire to be. These are three very distinct things, but they're all a part of me. They're all present in me, despite this conflict between them. And I can't disregard what I was. I can't dismiss it as a non-existent part of me. It is it's helped make me who I am today, and it's also helped shape my goals in the future. And there's a relationship between these things, despite the tension between them. And we can say the same thing, as it expresses itself in life, with the same problems that we have with these philosophical concepts. And then so there's a little quote here. I think it's from Schelling again, maybe. So such tension is, this might be actually from either Schelling or Frankl. Such tension is inherent in the human being and therefore is indispensable to mental well-being. We should not then be hesitant about challenging man with a potential meaning for him to fulfill. It's only thus that we can invoke his will to meaning from a state of latency. And actually, there's a really good quote here that I'll read. So let me cite a clear-cut example. Once an elderly general practitioner consulted me because of his severe depression. He could not overcome the loss of his wife, who had died 2 years before, and who he had loved above all else. Now, how could I help him? What could I tell him? Well, I refrained from telling him anything, but instead confronted him with the question, what would have happened, doctor, if you had died first, and your wife would have had to have survived you? Oh, he said. For her, this would have been terrible. How she would have suffered. Whereupon I replied, you see, doctor, such a suffering has been spared her. And it was you who have spared her this suffering, to be sure, at the price that now you have to survive and mourn her. He said no word, but shook my hand and calmly left my office. In some way, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice. Of course, this was no therapy in the proper sense, since first, his despair was no disease, and second, I could not change his fate. I could not revive his wife. But in that moment, I did succeed in changing his attitude towards his unalterable fate, inasmuch from that time on, he could at least see a meaning in his suffering. It is one of the basic tenets of local therapy that man's main concern is not to gain pleasure or to avoid pain, but rather to see a meaning in his life. Yeah. That is why man is even ready to suffer on the condition to be sure that his suffering has meaning. And this is what I think people like Cosmic Skeptic miss out. Like, they seem so adamant on like reducing everything to pleasure and pain, and so on and so they miss this. They miss the fundamental part, because they're too busy looking at the consequences of the fundamental.
I think that's a really good way of putting it, actually. I think it's a really good way of putting it. And perhaps I was thinking, while you were doing this, I was thinking perhaps we could set up, a live stream where you and him basically just speak about, have a friendly dialogue, like I did on moral nihilism. You have a friendly dialogue on existential nihilism. I think you really hit the nail on the head there with that, particular summary of what Alex's view is, which he just looks at the consequences rather than the whole of the picture.
Yeah.
So Jazakallah khair for your entire presentation today. And I was just thinking, we started 6 months ago.
Oh yeah.
Started 6 months ago. We definitely, we haven't wrapped up everything about nihilism, and we can sort of carry that onto the next video, inshallah, next Tuesday, which is
Inshallah.
nihilism. So is there anything you'd like to add just before we end on this dissertation? Of course, we're asking everybody to read it, and an atheist said that they will, and others are quite interested. So is there anything you'd like to add before we end, inshallah?
Yeah, so for the atheist, please have a think about the inevitability of faith. If you're one of them who have previously been someone who belittles it, and defines it simply as belief without reason, or it kind of looks down upon it as some sort of inferior thing, I want you to really think about all of the things that you have faith in, and not just these silly little side issues, but that are fundamental. So like this idea of reason itself, like, is underpinned by faith, very much so. And if it's not, have a think about how you're justifying it. Like, how is it that faith is something that you can, reason is something that you can trust? If even if you could take into consideration Husserl's point on this, the German philosopher, where he talks about, well, if logic and reason are the peculiarities of a being that evolved over time, then that means logic and reason evolved over time as well.
Yeah.
And if it evolved over time, that means it was different to what it is today, and in the future it will be different even more. And there is nothing eternal or objective about our ideas of reason and logic, if they are rooted in pure atheism, if they're rooted in pure in pure materialism. It's something that develops, and so you end up in an abyss there. And if that's where you want to be, go ahead. There's only so much you can do to sway people in one direction and the other, but I don't know how you escape that. So just take faith, and like, if you acknowledge that, you can at least at that point understand how much faith you have in your life. If everything that you're developing from these sources is based on this kind of unanchored reason, that's something that the strange peculiarity of an insignificant being, you're not really left with much. Maybe there's better arguments against that, but it'd be interesting to hear them. And for the believer who maybe struggles with the idea of faith and sees it as had some sort of inferiority complex with it, I'd like you to just think about, if you leave faith and kind of acknowledge this thing that the atheist does, or the anti-theist, as faith being the dirty word, you've not escaped it. In the same way, if you give up on religion because of the tension between free will and determinism, you've not escaped it. And it's not actually that much of a dirty word. It's simply acknowledging what it means to be a human being. If anything, it's acknowledging a fundamental truth about yourself. You by necessity have to make leaps of faith. Life is fleeting. There are choices to be made. You've only got a certain amount of time to make them. And we're always lacking knowledge. We're always lacking the bigger picture. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will guide who he wills. Some people will incline towards a belief in one thing Some people will incline towards belief in others. People will make leaps of faith in different directions, be that to belief or disbelief. And so, yeah, just take it seriously. Don't look at it as like, a silly thing. And especially if you're a believer, like, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala repeatedly calls us believers. He repeatedly calls us, the ones who have faith. Like it's integral. And like the Quran acknowledges how integral faith is to the human being repeatedly, over and over and over and over again. And when you think about it, there's so much truth to it. And inshallah, hopefully I've convinced you of that with this essay. Inshallah, hopefully you understand that being finite necessitates leaps of faith, and that you can't escape that, even if you deny it.
Absolutely. Jazakallah khair, Yusuf, for this entire series, actually.
Wa yak.
I can definitely see through the comments, and it's very hard to reply to everybody because some people are asking some deep questions in between. Perhaps what we could do next time, guys, is we simply answer your questions on nihilism, because we do this every time. Now we've finished it, because I've seen there's been a lot of very good questions and comments that we haven't responded to, but we're out of time today. Jazakallah khair, Yusuf. And just for everybody watching, we'll try and just keep this fixed at 6 p.m. British Standard Time on Tuesdays. Anything on nihilism we'll cover then, or any other topic to do with Yusuf. I'm very interested after the nihilism one to, cover Yusuf's brilliant blog on, the seeds of Tawheed and Jordan Peterson's sort of 12 rules of life. I think that is something which will attract atheists and hopefully, be a means by which people are guided to Islam. So Jazakallah khair, everybody, for joining us today.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair, everyone.
Wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.